Welcome, everybody, to the Rudder Marketing Aviation Business Podcast. We're really happy to have you here. My name's Tim Jedrek. I am the founder of Rudder Marketing, and I'm happy to have on our show today a special guest. So typically I kind of do a small intro or a little bit, but I guess I'll go for a bit. I had met Brandon through an acquaintance or a mutual friend, Andrew. He works with Purdue Global, and he introduced us together. Really started checking them out and really thought it was a very interesting program he's going. So I won't share the details. I'll kind of let Brandon spill the beans here. So Brandon, how about you give us a small introduction, and we'll keep going from there.
Yeah, you bet. Hey, thanks for having me. This is fun. My name is Brandon Seltz. I am a pilot. I'm a gamer and founder and CEO of Take Flight Interactive.
Okay. Cool. What is Take Flight Interactive?
Yeah, so we build an AI flight instructor. And so I'll tell you a little story about how I got into this. So I grew up playing video games. I was lucky enough that when I was 5 years old, the Atari 2600 came into the house, and that just blew up if you grew up as an 80s kid. And so really just played games my whole childhood, really gravitated toward airplane games. I'm an airplane nerd through and through. And so really played a lot of flight simulators. Every flight sim that came out, I played it. If it had a mission editor, I liked it even more. And so I just kind of spent my whole youth in the simulation side. So much so that I ended up working at Microsoft as a game designer on Flight Simulator. So, me and a team at Flight Sim, we worked on the mission system. So a way to bring interactivity into that sim. When I started, they wanted to build a lot of tutorials so that people could get in the Flight Sim and understand how to fly an airplane. And so, we're building this mission system and all these tutorials, and I've always wanted to get my pilot's license, and so this was the moment, right? So back then, if you looked online, how good is Microsoft Flight Simulator for flight training? It was pretty interesting. The posts are like, oh, you'll learn so many bad habits, you'll kill yourself, this, that, and the other. And I had had enough stick time in airplanes to know that I was a little better than that. And so, I kind of kept it a secret, to be honest. I went to get my pilot's license and didn't tell him anything about my simulation background. And oh man, I remember the first time taking off in an airplane. I remember looking down and I'm holding airspeed and the engine instruments are good. And I look out the wing and just have this realization that I have done this a million times already, And the secret didn't last very long. I think it was only the second or third lesson, where we're doing touch and goes, and we touched down and it was a little rough, and my instructor says, that was great, and I said, well, I think I could do a lot better than that. And he says, well, hey, I don't want you to be too hard on yourself, this, that, and the other. Well, we went around the pattern and I just greased it. I remember setting this little Piper down on its struts with the elevator, and I was like, that's what I'm talking about. And we're about halfway around the pattern before my instructor says anything, and I thought I did something wrong. I was like, hey, did I do something wrong there? You're kind of quiet. And he goes into a tirade, like, I don't understand. I don't get this. I've got 70-hour students that have never landed an airplane like this. That was your second one. I don't get it. And so I finally had to tell him, I'm like, look, I don't know how many hours I have in the sim. I work at Microsoft on Flight Sim. I thought I was going to be good at this, so I didn't say anything about it. And anyway, it was continue that story. I got my private pilot minimum time, minimum cost, and the whole thing was just a huge epiphany to me in two parts, really. One of them was the latent power in the desktop sim. I absolutely couldn't believe that I could crank up the winds, go home and practice my crosswind landings in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and then get in the airplane and do a whole lot better. And so, there was two parts to that. The latent power in the desktop sim was one. And then the other one was that people don't use it for training. I just thought it was crazy. And so I think it's something about my game design background, but I had a crystal clear vision of how we could take tried and true flight training curricula. We could wrap it in a game design wrapper so that it was engaging and fun. And then we could do things that you can't do in the airplane, like objectively measure the student's performance and repeat these scenarios very, very quickly to make that learning sticky. And so, I walked away from getting my private pilot with a crystal clear vision of a product that needed to exist. We founded Take Flight, and we've been on this path ever since.
I've seen this happen a few times where, people talk about the simulators really helping people when they're in their pilot training. but there is kind of a I don't know, like there's a community of people that do simulators, but they never really move on to doing the real thing, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that's partially due to fear, cost, or do you think that because I think it's a great tool. I do think that one is you're not gonna die from it, right?
Right.
So if you're flying a plane and then you make a mistake, that's it could be fatal. But on the other hand, a simulator, you're in an environment where you can make mistakes and you can learn
Yeah.
how to correct those mistakes.
Yeah.
So I do think it's a very, very great tool. And I guess my question is really, there is that community of people that are in the simulator world that don't really move on to becoming, getting their certificates and flying real planes. So
Yeah.
what can we do as a community maybe to help, encourage more people to fly, and get their pilot license? And also, what's kind of your take on the community that, they don't move on to do anything like, real. This is another story. I've seen people build out a full like 820 simulator in their basement. It's like, holy
Yeah.
crap, why don't you go fly the real thing?
Yeah.
It's really cool. But
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, the further I get into this, the more I realize that there's a really distinct line between the hobbyist and the commercial pilot. And a lot of that comes down to games, to enjoying the hobby of tweaking your PC and getting new peripherals and downloading that new add-on and checking it out. I think that's a hobby in itself. What I think is really interesting is when you cross the border and get into flight training land, a lot of that hobbyist stuff disappears. You don't have time to fiddle with the computer and the PC and all that stuff. You've got training to do. And so, I think there's a distinct line between those two markets there. But ultimately, I think it comes down to accessibility. Cost is obviously a huge factor, and if you don't have family or somebody that's a pilot that can kind of get you onto that airfield, there's a real barrier. I mean, those fences around the airport, they do keep people out. And so what can the industry do? Gosh, I think the flight training industry would do really good to draw the line between real world aviation and flight sim and talk about how it really is fun, and I think for anybody that's out there simulating already, as we're talking about, they've got a huge advantage, a huge leg up in flight training. And so I think they're a lot closer than they think they are. Hey, don't tell anybody this secret, but honestly, I think flying a real airplane is easier than flying the sim. You've got a wide peripheral view, you've got all the audio, you got the seat of the pants. So, hey, if you can get on a simulator and fly your A320 through a little tiny laptop window, then I think you'd do pretty well in the cockpit.
there you go. I did find it in the simulator. You mentioned that it's harder to fly a sim than the planes. I was doing instrument stuff, and I did like the 20 hours in an EATD simulator. I did notice that controlling the aircraft is incredibly difficult. Like the rudder pedals are extreme. I don't know if it's a setting in the computer. Maybe if you're a hobbyist, you can tweak it and stuff like that. But I was just using the flight school sim. And maybe they're on default settings. I don't know. But like you tap the rudder pedal like by a little bit, and then the whole plane goes sideways. I'm like, this is insane.
Yeah, I think rudder pedals is a really good example of why it's harder to fly a sim. In the real airplane, especially, lateral G's, you feel those so
Hmm.
quickly, and there's so much pressure on the rudder pedal that there's not in the sim that, yeah, that stuff kind of goes sideways. It's interesting. We'll get really high time pilots. We'll set them down at the sim and they'll do terrible. It's funny. They will sit there, on an ILS and they'll just zigzag the whole way down, and I'm watching them and I can see, they're passing their heading, but they're waiting for their butt to tell them something and it never does. And so they're right and left. And yeah, it's pretty interesting to watch.
It's just crazy. Yeah, I found it incredibly difficult to fly the sim. I mean, after I got used to it, it's not too bad. And then like there is those kind of the what do you call it, a somatic feelings. There's psychosomatic feelings, I guess you can say,
Yeah.
that when you fly, you feel those G's, you feel that vibration, you feel kind of the feedback from the inputs you put in the aircraft, that just aren't there with a simulator. So that's a challenge, and it's also kind of like what I mentioned too. Like the sensitivity might be different if you're not used to it. I mean, even airplanes itself, different airplanes fly different, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, there is a little hump to get over. I think that's what's interesting about, you take the hobbyist side. I can take this little laptop right here and that little joystick I've got on the shelf, and, I'm over the hump with that equipment. I can feel the airplane. I do know the pressures, and I've got my mappings all figured out. And it's interesting. My son, he's 11. I was soaring in a glider in Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 this weekend, and he wanted to try it, right? And so he came over and he put his hand on the stick, and I was like, well, go up the ridge a little bit more this way and you'll find some lift, And all of a sudden, the nose lifts up and he says, I feel it, you know. And so it is there. It is there. And it takes a little imagination. I think people that have been in the cockpit their whole life, they don't quite put in the effort to get over that little hump, but there's a lot of power in simulation if you can get over that hump. And I've seen it over and over in my life. And I told you my private pilot story already, but when I went to get my glider rating, it was the same thing. I went with 4 really high time pilots. Our first day, I remember getting up behind the tow plane and just like, oh yeah, hey, I've done this a million times. A really great soaring simulator out there called Condor that does the tow plane simulation and all that stuff. And so I remember my instructor asking me, hey, do you know what boxing the wake is? And I said, I think so. Is it like this? And I went around and he's like, yep. And it was interesting. We got down and, the 4 of us that had gone to training were talking. And one of the pilots was just like, that's it. I'm out. This is crazy. Towing up behind another airplane, like tied to another airplane with a rope. This is nuts. I'm out. He went to the Pima Air Museum for the rest of the week. But it was just really interesting. I mean, my time in the simulator really did set me up for success. And it's not just aviation. Recently I got into sailing, read a couple sailing books, just sounded really romantic. First thing I did was bought a couple simulators. And so, I simulated the heck out of it and then bought a boat. And my wife thought I was crazy. She's like, I'm not going sailing with you until you go out and prove to me that you can do this. You can come back alive. And, I tell you, I mean, I got there out in that sailboat and my hands are doing the right thing. The gust comes, the boat heels over, and my hand immediately does the right thing. And so, yeah, there's so much latent power in simulation for everything. I do a lot of VR car racing, and I guarantee I could turn a pretty good lap.
They say, like for coaches, for like, let's say sports and basketball, one of the most powerful tools is like visualization. It's kind of, I think it's kind of a similar brain pattern or neural link when it comes to simulators, and whether you're practicing flying a plane or sailing a boat. Is that the right verb for a boat? Sailing a boat?
Yep, sailing a boat.
Whether you're flying a plane or sailing a boat or training and train, whatever you want to call it, or doing a motorcycle or a car,
Yeah.
You're visualizing the steps that you need to take. And I think when you actually have that, when you do it in real life, it transfers over. So a lot of coaches do that in sports.
It's funny that you make that analogy. A really good friend of mine, Jeff Van West, he's a fantastic CFI, and when he first touched this technology, that was his comment. As he says, this really transforms the instructor into a coach. And what he meant by that was, we are training all the basics. You don't have to say push the right rudder because our virtual instructor has drilled that in. Anytime that ball starts to swing, our virtual instructor is going to call it out. And so, his point was that you can really get over a lot of the basics and get into the finer points a lot quicker if the student has experienced it in the sim. Because you're right, you may not feel that seat of the pants in the sim, but it is the same sight picture, right? It's the same procedure. The airplane acts roughly the same way when you put the right or wrong inputs in. And so, yeah, gosh, there are so many good correlations between the sim and the aircraft that I'm still blown away we don't sim.
I think partially it's because a lot of the CFIs want to build time. They don't want to get in the sim. So
there is that. Yeah, there is that.
We talk about that a lot in like the trade shows and conferences. Other sim companies, they always want to push their sim products to the flight schools and all that stuff. And even the DPEs and chief instructors and also the owners of the flight schools, they really encourage the use of the sim because all the benefits you described earlier, it reduces the time, the minimum time, not the minimums, but it reduces the time to actually become competent in flying the aircraft, and you got to do the procedures, and it could be cost effective. One of the things you brought up you said earlier was kind of a virtual instructor. So my kind of next question for you is like, obviously you have like, Redbird and there's another one out there. Those are kind of the big players, right? Of the simulator world, the AATD, BATD. What kind of separates, I guess, Take Flight and then your program with like the try like the regular standard Redbird and
Yeah.
I don't know, all
Yeah,
that
the
type of those
legacy
things.
simulator. Yeah, so, when sims are built, they are built to replicate an airplane. And as such, they're kind of sandbox environments, right? Like you sit down and it doesn't really tell you what to do, you know? And interestingly enough, when I started at Microsoft, that was their deal, is they said that, hey, people are calling support sitting at the end of the runway asking, what do I do? And so it's interesting. We're still kind of building the same thing. But with our stuff, imagine that sim with an instructional overlay. And so an on-sim curriculum, if you will, you can get into it and see all the maneuvers that you'll do in the airplane, from straight and level to steep turns to ground reference maneuvers, unusual attitudes, all that stuff. It's all laid out. You can see what you've done before, see what your high scores on some of those previous maneuvers, see what you need to work on next. We have a briefing, and so we heavily lean on the FAA documents. We really try to keep our curriculum standard to the FAA stuff. And so you can read about a briefing about the maneuver, the steps. We tell you how you're going to be scored. And then there's a little fly now button. And when you hit fly now, that's when Take Flight really manages the simulator for you. So we will launch whatever sim you've picked. We're compatible with X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Simulator and Prepared 3D and all sorts of sims. But we'll launch the sim, we'll pre-position, pre-configure the airplane, and then you're sitting there ready to go. And so let's say that we're doing a steep turn. The virtual instructor will give you a quick briefing. Hey, here we are, here's where we are, here's what we're going to do, and really talks you through it, right? So you roll into that bank, and if you roll too far, she says that's a little too far. And if you don't roll enough, she's like, give it a little bit more. And as you go around your steep turn, we're constantly looking through a matrix of logic to figure out the best way to instruct you, right? And so it's highly prioritized, right? So airspeed's the most important thing over altitude. In a steep turn, it's actually bank angle. So if your bank angle is way off, we're not going to talk about airspeed or altitude because you need to get that bank angle consistent if you're going to manage your turn. And so, yeah, in that way, you really get real-time feedback on how you're doing in the sim from this virtual instructor. And you get around the turn, you roll out on your heading, and it says, great, here's your score. And when the score comes up, you see all sorts of stuff like, how long it took you to roll in, what was your average bank throughout the turn, what was your average altitude, what was your airspeed. And what's really interesting about those scores is you can see all sorts of correlations in there. We were talking about in a steep turn, if you don't keep your bank angle right, you're not going to maintain altitude or airspeed. Well, you can really see that. There's a little graph of your bank angle, let's say. And let's say that you got too steep at one point in the turn. You can see that the graph of your bank angle go out of sorts. And you know what? You see your altitude drop. You see your airspeed go up. So as an instructor helping one of these students, you can really quickly look at their score screen and say, I see what happened here. You've got to keep your bank angle consistent. The beauty of it is you hit try again and boom, you are right there, ready to try again. And so, yeah, it really is that repetitive, try it yourself, get some feedback, see your score, try it again. It's those reps and sets, if you will, that really allow you to drill into what you're doing wrong and improve. And then ultimately you get into the airplane and it's the same thing, right? You know where to put your eyes, you know how to watch your bank. You start to get familiar with how much elevator you're going to put in, how much extra throttle it takes. And so yeah, I mean, we set up a system where you can do all those maneuvers with coaching, with scoring and all that stuff right there at home so that when you do get out to the practice area, it's like, I've been here. I know how to do this.
Let's go back to the product itself. So we talked a little about this instructor that's in there, the AI instructor. Is it purely a software program or is there hardware involved? Let's say I'm a flight school and I want to kind of implement something similar in my program. Maybe I want my students to try this out. I'll work alongside with the instructor as you go. What's kind of who are you trying to market this towards, and what's the kind of the use case for your product?
Yeah. So gosh, I think to really break into the flight school market, we need to partner with hardware manufacturers. So right now we are solely a software developer. We have focused on that. We are hardware agnostic. And so, in a lot of ways, it really doesn't matter to us what the hardware is. That said, it really does matter to flight schools. If there's flight schools out there that do have their own sim that's running prepared through your X-Plane or anything like that, it will run on it. But yeah, the next step step for us is to partner up with some manufacturers of hardware so we can deliver a turnkey solution, something that just works in the flight school. Something really easy to do right now is suggest it to your students as a training aid. Any students out there that are looking to learn and looking for things that they can do at home, and especially if they are coming from a sim background anyway, then this is a fantastic tool. They've likely got everything they need to run it. But yeah, hey, look, we're looking to learn. We would love to hear from those in the industry that want to start using this kind of technology. I would love to hear what kind of simulator technology they've been using, what they like, what they don't. If we were to go befriend some hardware manufacturers in the industry, some good recommendations would be great.
Is Take Flight Interactive, is that a kind of a layer on top of like Microsoft Simulator or X-Flight, or is its own thing?
It's its own thing. Yeah, we're kind of run independently of all those things. You can think of us as kind of an add-on that is compatible with those various simulators. So yeah, if you had X-Plane running at home and you had your whole sim set up, then it's just another additional install. We'll auto detect all that stuff and we'll run on it.
Okay, that's pretty cool then. So then I guess the requirements. If I'm a flight school, I'm just trying to break it down for our audience.
Sure.
So if they are, let's say you're a flight school, you have some students and you want to try some simulator stuff. So kind of the requirements in this case would be to have some hardware installed, as far maybe some rudders and then maybe the yoke and all that stuff and a mixture. Have the screen for your instruments, and then after that you want to install X-Plane and then install Take Flight Interactive.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's, the world of simulators is broad, everything from a laptop to a joystick, all the way up to something where you've put rudders and yokes and everything else on it. We're pretty agnostic to all that stuff. And so we'll run on any of it, and we're happy to help too. You can reach out to sales@takeflightinteractive.com, and you'll probably reach me or Glenn. And yeah, we're happy to show you. We worked on a whole bunch of different programs, and though we don't put together sims for people, we have a whole lot of recommendations, so we'd be happy to give that.
Cool. What is I guess so? How long have you been doing this for? Just out of curiosity, since you've been doing this for.
Yeah. Oh gosh, let's see. We founded Take Flight in 2015, but that wasn't the first crack at the technology. I'd say we started building the roots of this stuff when we were back at Microsoft. We continued to develop some of this stuff when we were working for Redbird, and then the team and we've been together since Microsoft days, and so you can go back into the early 2000s as to when this stuff started.
So then, what type of, I guess, do you have any like cool stories or case studies, testimonials that kind of has happened in the past 10 years doing this that you've seen some really tangible results with students in their training?
Yeah, I mean, that's the coolest part about it for me, is thinking back to that epiphany where I stepped out of the airplane and said, holy cow, I've got an idea. I think we can give this to everybody. It's really cool. We get all sorts of stories all the time, and it's interesting how similar, the kind of customer testimonials are to my experience, We started working with an EAA chapter, and we just heard from them. They've got 2 kids going through the program right now. And the I'm not going to remember the girl's quote verbatim, but she basically said it's really cool to be able to do it on the sim and then get out there in the airplane and have already done it. And then we also got a testimonial from her instructor that basically said the same thing. Like, I couldn't believe she was doing maneuvers to that level on her first try. And so yeah, it really is a testament to, if you can do it in the sim, you can do it in the airplane. We've got countless stories like that. We've got a testimonials section on the website with all sorts of student pilots that swear by it. And then we've been working with some universities that have really kind of showed that out as well. Liberty University was one of our really early customers. And it's with Oshkosh going on this week, I was just thinking about that. We were at Oshkosh having dinner with them, and really it was kind of the first year they had gotten started with it. And I remember asking all sorts of questions like, what are the correlations between the sim and the airplane? If a student, works to 90s in the simulator, are they great in the airplane? And, and if you have students that are only get up to 70s in the sim, are they kind of 70% students in the airplane? And we were really excited to hear, yeah, there's a huge correlation between what they do in Take Flight and what we see in the airplane. And then a couple years later, one of the professors there, Stephen Brenly, as his thesis, he wrote one, and I'm not going to remember the name of this off the top of my head, but it was basically like, how good is AI flight instruction for determining success in the airplane? And there were really three key points to it. One of them was that, yes, there is correlation. So you can test somebody on the sim and see what kind of aptitudes they have in the airplane, which is just huge. And it really speaks to a whole application of this technology we've never even tried, which is a screening tool, for military, commercial, even universities. It would be a great screening tool to know that they were going to get successful students. Um, the other one, it was reduced time. No, gosh, I wish I remember the third one. I did write it down here. Let me see if I can find it real quick, because it really was. Um, so yeah, it was an effective predictor of completion of the flight training. It was a better predictor of performance compared with some of the other aptitude tools out there. And finally, it was a great predictor of the training performance in the airplane. And so, as an instructor, if you see somebody doing good in the sim, you can bet they're going to do well in the airplane too.
So the kind of looking at the paper you got there and the questions we
Yeah.
kind of had lined up. The one of the next ones was actually talking about like the syllabus. So you kind of mentioned there's scores involved for certain maneuvers. The question I guess I have for you is it aligned with like 141? Is it 61 type thing? Is it kind of aligned? Do you like, let's say the Jepson or Gleim syllabus? Do you guys kind of apply that? Here are the maneuvers for the syllabus from Gleim, and then we're gonna do the exact same lesson plan, or do you guys switch up and have your own kind of like curriculum syllabus thing for private pilot and beyond?
From a curriculum standpoint, we tried to keep it very, very generic. We knew that all the different students, all different flight schools and universities may be using Gleims or someone else's curriculum. And so we didn't stick to one. We kept it very general for a reason. It's because, the way that this works best is if you can give a student some homework. It's like, hey, you know what? We're going to do power on, power off stalls and slow flight next time you show up. And so it really works best for the student to go do those maneuvers in the sim, practice up, and once they're comfortable and familiar and scoring well, go validate those things in the airplane. And so, no, we kept it real general. We used the FAA ACS. We really chopped that up, sliced and diced it. We used those thresholds for scoring. We even use, the FAA's airplane flying handbook and stuff like that for our briefing. So, yeah, we tried to keep it really generic so it'd be applicable to any of those curriculum.
Okay, so it's really customizable for any school that's want to use it and apply it for their students.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you can imagine scrolling down a list of maneuvers and you can
Mhm.
fly any one of them in the list. And so as an instructor, there's a lot of flexibility there to say, I want you to go fly X, Y, and Z before we get in the airplane again.
Got it. Talking about maneuvers, so we're just talking about private pilot maneuvers like steep turns around the points. I'm wondering, I don't know if I haven't checked out in a while. Are you guys expanding out to doing instrument training and commercial training, and also like for chandelles and approaches and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to build the entire stack, the entire ab initio stack, all the way from private pilot all the way to ATP prep. So yeah, I mean, instrument is the killer app for this technology, and we are dying to build it. I think it's interesting. When we started out, there was a real sense that you couldn't train private pilot type maneuvers in the sim, And I had just proven that so wrong in my own experience and seen it with other people that, we set out to kind of build that intro to flight to make sure that we could do it. We had an eye to youth outreach and aviation. We knew that just like you were talking about earlier, that the sim is a fantastic pathway, an incredibly accessible pathway into aviation. And so, we started out building some youth aviation products, some introductions to aviation, and then built out the full private pilot. But yeah, absolutely. It's interesting from a business perspective, we got involved in military work far earlier than I thought we would. It was kind of much further down our biz dev roadmap, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really consumed the company building for the Navy. They want more stuff faster all the time. The beautiful part of that is we're building some incredible technology on the DoD side of the fence that we can't wait to bring back to the civilian world. Yeah,
Let's talk about that for a bit.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool, man. I know, obviously, with this, maybe top secret clearance and all this stuff, you gotta kind of keep stuff classified. But what are some of the cool projects in the DoD world and military applications that you might be able to share to the public?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple that we're working on that I think are going to be huge in the civilian world, and one of them isn't announced just yet, so I'll have to keep that one quiet. But the other one is super cool. So the Navy has a new helicopter trainer called a T3. And they built some new simulators to support that. Those simulators are built by Frasca, and they're kind of big, they're augmented reality sims. And so they don't have a full dome around them, but it's the full cab of the helicopter, all the real world avionics and switches and stuff like that. And the VR goggles have pass-through video. And so what we're able to do is we're able to put pointers and stuff in the cockpit pointing at physical switches. And so let's say that we're training checklists and we say, turn on the battery master. Well, if a second goes by and you don't turn on the battery master, we'll go into a secondary set of instructions that says, hey, the battery master's on the lower left panel, and we can put an arrow on it. And it's just so cool in augmented reality to see these arrows in the real world. So it's between your hand and the battery master switch. But if you get those goggles on and you look around like this, it's all lined up in 3D space, and it's incredible to be able to point things out like that. Yeah, I can't wait to bring that sort of tech to the civilian world, because things like learning flows and checklists and all that stuff's about to get a lot easier.
It'd be really cool for like the ATP stuff, they do the airline flows and all this stuff. So
yeah.
talking about the customers, we talked a little bit about military applications here. Kind of going back on our introductions. So I had mentioned that I had met you through a friend, Andrew, through Purdue Global, I think is what that's from. So great guy. He's really awesome. Actually, by the way, so I'm going to make a small interruption on the podcast. He had actually introduced us. So Andrew was on the podcast a few months ago, and then he actually introduced us to Rainier, and now you.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So kind of want to take
over there, yeah.
Take a quick commercial break here. If you know anybody anyone who's listening to this podcast, or even Brandon or anybody that wants to be on the podcast, we're really happy to have you on here. The whole point is to create really good content for the aviation community, whether it's business related, whether it's just aviation and fun stuff. I'd love to have you on as a guest on the podcast. So check out ruddermarketing.com and give us a call 314-804-1200, info@ruddermarketing.com. Okay, back to the show. So we had met Andrew, and then he was a great guy, and then he introduced me to you, which was pretty awesome. So I think there's some partnerships kind of in the works. What's kind of the story going on with you and Purdue Global, and what's the application for Take Flight and Interactive, I guess, in the collegiate space or in the university space?
Yeah, we've been working with Purdue for a while. I think this is one of those things where we tell our story and Purdue says, hey, I really like that. They're always looking to produce more pilots and kind of fill this void. And they're pretty forward looking when it comes to technology. We're doing a couple things with those guys. We're doing an FAA aviation workforce grant, which is pretty cool. We are putting Take Flight and simulators and some training for teachers into a bunch of schools around Indiana. That's a cool program. It's got a ground school component. They get their ground school. They also get their UAS certificate as well. And so that's a pretty cool program. Oh gosh, possibilities are endless though. I think Purdue Global is a great example of a way that Purdue can introduce some standardization in that this software is going to teach you how to do X, Y, and Z. And they know that across all of their Purdue Global affiliates, that students are going to hear it the same way. That's one of the beauties of this product is it's incredibly standardized, right? Any student that gets in there and goes through this curriculum, they're going to hear all the same things. They're all going to be working toward the same goals, the same scores, and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, we don't have any real plans to go global, if you will, with Purdue Global, but those conversations are going. There's plenty of opportunity there, and we're excited about it.
Oh, pretty good. Talking about kind of Purdue Global and the customers there, these are big customers. You have Purdue Global working with you. You got Liberty University. You got the military backed up to you. Where do you see, I guess, Take Flight Interactive going in the next couple of years? I mean, you're obviously seeing a lot of success here. What's kind of your mission and vision? Where do you see it taking off in the next, I guess, 1 year, 5 year, 10 years?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. In so many ways, we've barely scratched the surface. We've done some really cool stuff for the military. It's highly focused on their training platforms. But, all of those projects have something for the rest of the world, if you will. And so, yeah, we're really excited to get on with the Instrument. I think Instrument is just going to be a killer app for this technology. As I said earlier, finding some really good hardware partners and coming to the smaller flight school market with some turnkey solutions is a really important thing for us in the next coming year. Uh, Commercial aviation, is one. It's interesting. You talked about the smaller schools, the Part 61 schools, and what we found with, there's not a really strong top-down management curriculum defined like there is in larger training organizations. And so that one's been a challenge for us, but it's interesting. Every time we get a student and a set of instructors that understand the power of this stuff, it's always cool to hear. But yeah, I think coming up with a solid set of turnkey training solutions is going to help us penetrate that market. And then on the commercial side, I must say that some of the things that we're developing for the military are just going to be killer in the commercial space. A lot of the crew resource management type of training they do, a lot of the comms training they do. Yeah, we're going to come out with some very, very cool products for that in the next couple years. And, I guess the dream really is that, imagine a student somewhere in Africa that has access to a small simulator. And on that simulator is a full-blown ab initio training product, right? From private to instrument to commercial to multi, all the way up to ATP prep. It's just getting to the point where we could even stream that kind of stuff. And so the accessibility to this training is just getting better and better all the time. And so, yeah, I'm just excited for all the things that we can do. It's a long list.
You mentioned comms and stuff like that. So radio communication is a big kind of hurdle for new pilots. I remember when I first started flying, and I first started flying in a non-towered field. Eventually, I fly a towered, but a lot of stuff I do is like in the Podunk Airport, middle of nowhere.
Right.
That's just my take on it. I remember I was with a CFI during this Discovery flight. He just, he's announcing his intentions, going to runway 18, whatever. He's just talking. It sounded like another language to me. I think comms are radio communication is a very important part of the training that is there.
Yeah.
And we had on the show Plain English. I think they were on here a few what do you call it, years ago. They're one of our first ones on the show. So maybe
that's cool.
It'd be kind of cool to have the collaboration. I might send you their information too. They might.
No, those guys are great. Yeah, I've met them. They were actually in the same SIBR cohort we were when we first got introduced to the military. And so yeah, we've been on the same trajectory as them for a while.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so we're coming up on the 45-minute mark here. What I like to do around this time is open the door up for questions. So and we have about 6-7 people in the audience right now, and then I don't know if there's anyone listening on Facebook or Instagram, YouTube, whatever. So if you have questions, put them on the chat, and then me and Brandon can answer as quick as best as possible. Another thing I'd like to do around this time is for you, Brandon, you've talked a little bit about your platform, some of the experiences, some of the success stories. Our audience is primarily flight school owners and managers, leaders in the flight school community space. There's also people in our audience that listen to our social media and follow us. A lot of them are B2B businesses. Think about I don't know, scheduling software, for example, or airplane parts. There are a lot of people that are servicing the flight training, industry.
Yeah.
So, what is kind of your call to action towards them, and what do you guys want them to do? If they're a flight school, do you want to how should they get in contact with you, or what's the best way to get started, or give them your pitch?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I think hardware is going to play a big part in that. So, for those flight schools that have sims running something like Prepared 3D or X-Plane, it could be ready to go today. And we've got a lot of programs specifically for the flight schools themselves. So, if you have a bunch of students, we can create a batch of licenses so that you have access to all of that student data so that you and your CFIs can see how your students are doing. Like I said earlier, you can give them homework and then check in and see if they've done that and how well they've done that. So yeah, a lot of things we can do, and what's interesting about the smaller flight schools is they're all a little bit different. And so we would love to know, how they work and how we could help their workflow. I think from a curriculum standpoint, it's a no-brainer. It fits really well. From a technology standpoint, I think where we are today, it does take a flight school with a slightly more technical staff, if you will, somebody that's willing to install a piece of software and calibrate a joystick. Like I said earlier, I think the easiest thing to do is if you have students that are looking for additional training aids that they can do, and especially if they've mentioned simulator use at all, then this is really the perfect program for them. And like I said, if you get a bunch of students, you're able to track their progress and stuff like that. And so even if you don't have a sim in the school, it can still be a part of your program.
And then, so to just get started, is this a matter of going on the website and downloading the software package, or is there anything else? Do you have to do it? Do they have to contact you, or what's the process of
No.
onboarding?
If you go to takeflightinteractive.com, up on the top right, you'll see a download button. That'll take you to a page that describes what simulators we're compatible with. There's additional documentation there. Yeah, and there's a free download. You can download it and try it without paying anything. So yeah, it's all there. And of course, you can let us know if you need any help at support@takeflightinteractive.com.
Nice. Anything, keep the floor open for questions in here. I don't know if I don't see any in the chat over there, but let's see what we got here. Let's see what else. Let's see if I have any more questions too. Do you have questions for me?
Gosh,
throw the podcast around here.
No, you were nice enough to give us a list of questions. And so, we as a team talked about it and what was important to call out. I had missed a good talking point. You were asking about universities and others and some data that came out to that. University of North Dakota did a really good study. Dr. Ryan Guthridge over there, they did a study of take flight. And it was really interesting. One of the keys to their findings was for each 10 hours of simulator training, flight training time is reduced by 3.4 on average.
3.4 hours?
3.4 hours, yeah. So for every 10 hours of simulator pre-training, flight training time is reduced by 3.4. That study also found that sitting there with Take Flight's virtual instructor was about as effective as getting in an airplane with a real one, too. So, I think there's a whole lot of efficiency saved. I think if I look forward to the future and what I would like to see in training, I would love to see these new tools allow the in-aircraft training to really evolve. And so, you were talking on the radio and how kind of scary that was, especially when you're not coming from a busy area. Well, I trained right here in the Seattle area, and so we had plenty of airspace, plenty of ATC, but we spent 90%, I feel like, of my training going back and forth to the practice area where there was no flight planning, there was no ATC comms required. And if we can learn to train in the sim, practice in the sim, and simply validate in the airplane, then I think we can use that airplane for far better things like transiting that airspace, right? Doing those things that make us nervous, making go, no go decisions on cross countries. All of those things are things that when I got my private pilot license in the mail, I could go out and do steep turns and slow flight all day long, but boy, transiting Class Bravo airspace was something I really wasn't willing to try, even though I was licensed to do it. And so I think there's a lot of evolution that can happen in GA training to kind of get the maneuvers out of the way early so that we can focus on more advanced things before the check ride.
I will say even as a private pilot, before I got instrument stuff done, like the Class B thing is insanely scary. It's like I don't know if it's a pilot thing. I was like, it's always you don't want to bust the Bravo, right? I'm like, okay,
Right.
hold on a minute. So I was always getting nervous, and I live in a small city. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and we have a Bravo airspace, but even still, it's like I was scared to the I don't know, to the shitter with calling the approach controller and saying, hey, can I come in your airspace and land in the main airport?
Right.
Cool experience, by the way. If you ever get a chance to land in a Class Bravo airport, or a student, if you have a student, that's one of the best experiences as a student I had. I was like probably 20 hours in, and I was like, hey, can we land at Lambert, which is like the STL airport for like the 121 operations. And my instructor kind of looks at me like, okay, fine, let's do it. And I just remember it was a night flight too, and it was one of the most insane things I've.
That's funny.
Now I can do it easily, but.
Very similar story. So during my private pilot, we combined my night-long cross-country with a landing at Portland International Airport.
Oh, so
And my
cool,
CFI
man.
was like, "Oh, it's dead this time of night. Don't even worry about it." And of course, we get there and you can see the landing lights all lined up to come in, and there was a 737 holding short, and you could tell that the controller just really didn't want to let us in. He had us approach and he had a sidestep, and as soon as my wheels hit the runway, he's like, "All right, get off the," basically, sidestep to the right. And then he immediately cleared the 737 to take off. And oh my gosh, I mean, I heard that thing roar past us behind the airplane. Both my wife and the CFI had their necks craned to see it, but I was doing all I could just to look out the window and stay out of their way.
Wow. So we did have a few questions roll in the
Sure,
chat, so
sure,
we can kind of do some of these questions over here. So
sure.
Rodrigo's asking, this is a fun one. What was your biggest learning curve from a developer to a startup CEO?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, boy, running a company.
Running a company.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that. Yeah, it's boy, we just dove off. We really did, and it's pretty interesting. One of the things that I learned from a management standpoint working at Microsoft was how incredibly important it is to keep your team focused and don't let them worry about all the business side things that you've got to worry about. And oh boy, there's been some lots of sleepless nights, but it's fun. I mean, that's the cool part about being a founder and a CEO is there are very distinct parts of that roles, right? So, as a founder, you're a visionary. You are kind of trying to crystalline this vision and beat the table and make everybody see it. But then as a CEO, boy, there's a long list of things that you've got to get done, whether it's business formation stuff or sales or communications or, I mean, the first time that, I will tell you the most exciting thing that's ever happened is getting a yes on a Navy proposal, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy to think that, I can sit here at my desk in my home office here in Redmond, Washington, and write a proposal that the government accepts. It still blows me away thinking about that. But yeah, it is. Every day is different. The list is long. It's exciting. This is a bit personal. I struggled with ADD growing up. And in sitting in school, listening to the teacher. I mean, it really was kind of like the Peanuts thing, where the teacher's like wah 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 wah, and my brain's always over there clicking, thinking about 20 different things. Well, I can't tell you how much of a gift ADD is when you're a CEO. And when you've got, 20 different things to do, all vastly different, and distractions coming from every little way, being able to switch tasks really quick is an absolute gift. And yeah, it's starting a company is something I probably wouldn't wish on my worst enemies, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
It's insanely difficult. And you talked about some of the adrenaline rushes you had, like getting the proposal sent. I remember I had my first sale. This is not even Rudder marketing. I was I was trying to start a business. I was working in the factory for decades, whatever. And I had sold my first website. It was like $100 or something like that. It was nothing to what we do now these days. It was like a simple WordPress website, one page or something like that. But just getting the sale done was like the biggest adrenaline rush I had in my life because I'm like,
Yeah.
this is the first time I've seen money come my direction that was not through like a W-2 job. I was like, this is insane. And then leading up to me going full time in the business, that was also insanely difficult. So really good question from Rodrigo here.
Yeah, that's fun.
Uh,
Thanks, Rodrigo.
let's see here. We got some other ones. How do you see AI and VR technology evolving in the trading space over the next 5 years?
Oh,
Give
yeah.
me an
Yeah, real easy. Well, what's interesting about AI, especially the way, especially the Chat GPT type AI that people think about, it's so incredibly powerful because there's so much data for it to comb through. There's the entire World Wide Web and all the stories and things we've ever told each other are there. But what's interesting about AI in the flight training space is that data doesn't exist. A student in a cockpit with an instructor, what that airplane does, what the student, what the instructor said to do, what the student did to recover, how the aircraft behaved. I mean, all those things don't exist in a database anywhere. And so, I think over the next 10 years, the aviation industry is going to be playing catch up. They're going to be trying to create that data so that we can go back and analyze some of this stuff. But some of the stuff that we're doing, I mean, and when we talk about AI, we aren't chat GPT, large language model kind of stuff. We leverage really tried and true game design techniques to get our virtual instructor to feel sentient, for you to feel like there's somebody in the seat next to you. But yeah, this isn't the big, large learning models.
Yeah, I was about to say, is Take Flight Interactive and then the AI virtual instructor, that's not, you're not using like an MCP or an API protocol with like, let's say, I don't know, Claude or ChatGPT, OpenAI stuff.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, we sit here and watch trends and know where things are going to predict what the
Yeah.
student is going to do and what we should say to correct it. But no, we're not leveraging any of that type of stuff.
This is more just a me and you, not really me and you conversation, it's more of a, I guess, AI conversation, but like, do you think that AI, the word AI, is overhyped and really it's just when people say AI, it's really just a program? I mean, like you think about it, I'm a developer too, and I make a software program and it says, okay, if I put one input, it gives me an output, right?
Yeah.
And then we've operated like this for decades for software engineering, right?
Yeah.
And then out of nowhere, ChatGPT says, hey, we have this new model that does the exact same thing, but we're gonna call it AI. And then the entire marketing trend goes crazy, and the entire society and social media blows it up. Says, "Oh, AI and robots are taking over the world," and it gets all hyped up. But in reality, it's the same thing. You're putting ones and zeros in the computer, and the computer's giving you ones and zeros back. I mean, it's not. People kind of, I don't know. What's your take? I think it's kind of a stupid wrapper on the whole entire
Well,
industry.
it
I think we gotta.
definitely is. Yeah. I mean, I think we've got a tech bubble, that we haven't seen since the dot-com bust, really,
Comms,
waiting
yeah.
to happen, So yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, that's one of the things about technology is out there on the bleeding edge. There's people saying it can do things that it can't, and so I think we need to be careful with it. Back to the previous question, or back to the other part of this question about VR, I think
Yeah.
we're going to see a very similar thing that we saw with VR with AI, which is, you go back 3 years ago or 2 years ago, you're seeing commercials of the whole family sitting on the couch, all with their VR goggles on, watching the Olympics. Well, it didn't happen. And the same thing with AI. I think a lot of the hype is going to disappear. That said, I think there are some incredibly powerful tools. Go back to me writing contracts for the Navy. There are certain clauses in those contracts that I had a whole lot of help. There are things called DFARs, which are Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations.
Okay.
And there's a million of them, and they are written not to be human readable. And so, when it comes to stuff like that, there are some really powerful tools. Like I'm able to ask AI, hey, go give me a clause based on cyber data rights, and list all the DFARs that are applicable, and it comes back with something that I would have had to ask a legal team to give me 6 months to review. And so, I think there's a lot of hype out there, but boy, there's some powerful stuff too. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how people leverage AI more than what AI can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think I think it's funny. And then what do you call it? Lucas has put another comment here. Is like a couple of years ago, AI was just a bunch of algorithms. And I'm like, yeah, this is the same thing.
Yeah.
We have we're cut out of time here. We have one last question, then we're gonna end the stream here. Well, this is from Carla. How might technologies like electric aircraft, advanced avionics, I'm assuming also like Take Flight Interactive and virtual AI instruction change the pilot training requirements? Obviously, just recently we had Mosaic pass in Oshkosh that was kind of expanding the sport pilot licensing stuff and all that. We had the reauthorization bill with FAA that kind of went through. They're still working some kinks out with that. So obviously, a lot of the regulations we've been dealing with for decades are now under the table and under negotiation with the new administration. So a lot of technology. There's also the change in politics. Where do you kind of see the future in regulation and and pilot training requirements, and how does Take Flight Interactive play a role in that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of back to the data again. The FAA is a very data-driven organization. And so I think, as we gather data that shows the correlations between the things we can do in the sim and things we can do in the airplane, we're going to learn a lot. Interestingly, I don't know how much regulations have to change. Let's take the 40-hour rule, for example. I think a really A piece of low-hanging fruit is to say, hey, well, people can get their licenses faster if they can do it all without this many hours in an airplane. But if you look at the averages, I mean, they're almost double what we are given as a minimum anyway. And so, we gain a whole lot of efficiency just getting people down to where the regulations are now. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think about how the regulations might change. And again, this is where I kind of lean on our customers in a lot of ways. One of the reasons I like working with the universities is because they want to do the research, and so I'm really interested in finding a partner who has all of this data on how they've trained in the airplane, like what their training has looked like for the past 10 years. And then let's take adding some technologies like take flight, and now let's look at the data. How is it different? And so, yeah, I feel like, kind of back to the AI question, we are in a massive fact-finding period here. And so, yeah, I think people need to think about, okay, how can we prove this technology, or how do we let this technology prove itself? We have so many anecdotal pieces of data that it works, but it's really the data from, hey, here's what was happening in the airplane before, and here's what's happening in the airplane today. And so a lot of our military work will go that way. The government is kind of slow to move, though, and so I think the industry can kind of find out those things a lot sooner.
Cool. Right up. And here we are over the hour. So really appreciate Brandon Seltz hopping on the call here, hopping on this podcast. So I'll do one last call to action for Brandon. So if you are a flight school owner, if you are a university, have a program, 141 program, if you have a lot of data,
Yes.
a lot of data on your students, highly recommend checking out Take Flight Interactive. It is a AI virtual instructor that is kind of goes on top of X-Flight or any simulator program that you might have. They work with a lot of hardware that you might already have installed at your flight school, and will help your students train more effectively. So check out takeflightinteractive.com and get in contact with Brandon to implement that program in your flight school. On the other hand, if you are a flight school and looking to expand your school, get more students, get more customers, buy new planes, I highly recommend checking out rightruddermarketing.com. Give us a call, 314-804-1200. Again, this is Tim with Right Rudder Marketing. You are on the Aviation Business Podcast. We really are happy to have you on here, and we will see you next time. See you. Yeah.